Welcome back to Gen Z Bible class. We're going to be continuing on in Genesis 5 this week, and we're going to be talking primarily about this subject of genealogies. Genealogies is just like, the story of your family tree. It gives you a list of all the ancestors, like which father had this son and so on and so forth. And, this could be kind of boring if you don't like just reading a bunch of names, but there are some really interesting things in these genealogies. I guess we should think a little bit about why they are in the Bible to begin with, and there's three main reasons why these genealogies are important. A lot of it has to do with the history of Israel and the fact that they had to keep track of their family lines because the sons would inherit the land of their ancestors, the fathers. And every 50 years, the land would go back, if they happened to lose the land, would go back into the hands of the original family line. So it's important to keep track of, who your great-grandfather was. The other reason is for the priest that had to come from a certain family line. They all had to be descendants of Aaron and his son Zadok. And so that was another reason why, especially for the Levites, those are the priests that served in Israel, that they had to have proof that they were from this family line. So that's another reason. But another, and I think more important reason, a bigger reason, is because of this design in the Bible that all points to Christ. Now, we read this verse in Genesis 3:15 that promised Adam and Eve that they would have a descendant and that descendant would crush the head of Satan. Of course, we know now from our perspective that they were talking about Christ. And of course, he becomes, one of the descendants of Eve simply by the fact that he was born as a human person when he was born. So by default, I guess we are all descendants of Eve. But it gets more interesting than that because when you follow through time and you get these other family lines, which is one of the things we're going to be talking about today, there's a certain lineage that Christ is said to follow. And in order to fulfill the prophecies, they had to follow this genealogy. And the Bible does actually have genealogy all the way from the time of Adam down to the time of Christ. So that's the third reason, maybe the most important reason why we look at genealogies. So what we want to look at now is we want to remember what we looked at last time, because really we were talking about a genealogy in chapter 4. In this case, it was the genealogy of Cain. Remember that sad story in Genesis 4 where Adam and Eve has this kid and he ends up becoming the first murderer. We're not off to a very good start in human beings here. But Cain, who was Adam and Eve's first son, kills his brother Abel, and a very sad thing. And he really feels like that's it for him. Somebody can come now and kill him out of retribution for what he did to his brother. But God protects him and he says, no, I'm not going to allow anybody to touch you. And as a result, that's a picture of God's mercy. But as a result, Cain ends up having this family line. It goes down, 7 or 8 generations. And it all ends with this guy, Lamech, who was not the most upstanding citizen in the world, judging from what we know about him. But then he has 3 sons, and that's pretty much where the line of Cain ends, with those 3 sons. If you remember, there were 3 sons, Jubal, Jared, and Tubal, and each one of them had a different interest. One was interested in music, and sort of develop music. The other was a shepherd, and the other was working with metal and tools and things like that. So we were watching as technology and culture was developing over the 1600 years between the time of Adam and the time of Noah. And really that's where these 2 genealogies that we're looking at, that's the time period that they take place. But now we're going to look at a different genealogy, and that's the genealogy of Seth. At the end of chapter 4 and the very beginning of chapter 5, we are reminded that Adam and Eve had another son. His name was Seth, and I don't want to say he replaced Abel, but he was a comfort to them. And Adam was 130 years old when he has his third son. I think we can assume he must have had other daughters, because Cain, does have ends up with a couple of with a wife and his descendants. So just have to kind of keep all this time frame in mind. But when you live to be like 900 years old, you can have a lot of kids, and that's exactly what happens with Adam and most of the people that lived back then. But I drew up this little chart and this graph that kind of puts these two lineages side by side. And the one thing you'll notice about it is when you follow through the line of Cain, it just ends with those three sons that we mentioned. And when you follow the line of Seth, of course, now the line of Cain ends because they get to the time of Noah's flood and everybody's killed except for the line of Seth. And that's the primary difference between the line of Cain or any other line of any of Adam's descendants before the flood. The line of Seth was the one the Bible is following, because Seth's line was the only one that gets through the flood. And that's what you can kind of see in this diagram. You can also notice that there are a couple of names that I mentioned in the line of Seth. Again, sometimes the only thing we know about a person in these different lines is their name and how old they were and when they were born. And there's not a lot of storylines about each one of them. But when we come to these two individuals, Enoch is one of the descendants of Seth, and his son Methuselah. Some very interesting things we learn about them. And that's what we want to take a look at as we look at Genesis chapter 5. So let's begin. We'll see how this whole chapter works. We'll read verses 3 to 5, and it kind of sets up the pattern as to how this whole chapter is put together. When Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth. And after Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. And altogether, Adam lived a total of 930 years. And then he died. And this really becomes the pattern for this whole chapter. It gives the person's name, how old he was when he has his kid, and then how many years he lives after that, and then it adds it all up and tells you how old he ends up being. So Adam lived to be 930 years old, and we don't know the details about all the other kids that Adam and Eve had, but we do know that over 900 years, what did he say, one kid every 10 years, that would add up, and it wouldn't take long for the earth to get populated that way. So as I said, we're going to look at two particular people in this lineage, and one of them is Enoch. Now he shows up a few generations down the line, and we go to Genesis 5:21 to 23, where it says that Enoch had lived 65 years, and he became the father of Methuselah. After he became the father of Methuselah, Enoch walked faithfully with God 300 years and had other sons and daughters. And altogether, Enoch lived a total of 365 years. And it says that Enoch walked faithfully with God, and then he was no more because God took him away. That's something really interesting about him that sets him apart from pretty much anyone else. I don't know if these numbers mean anything, but it's interesting that Enoch lived 365 years. It's like 1 year for every day of the year. I don't know if there's any significance to that, but it's just kind of interesting to notice that. But the really interesting thing about Enoch was what it says about the fact that God had taken him. And when you read that into Hebrew, it's making very clear that he never actually died a physical death, but that God took him up to heaven. And we get this picture that Enoch was so close to God. He was faithfully walking with God and probably by this time, after, I don't know, 300 years, maybe the year 300 or so, when he's born. I sort of lost track of when all that happened. But we know that the earth at that time, there were all kinds of people. There were good people, there were bad people, a lot of bad people, a lot of bad things going on. So it might have been rare to find somebody that really stayed faithful to God and continued to walk with him. But you just get the sense that Enoch was so close to God and so much his friend that God spared him the experience of death and just brought him right to heaven. And Enoch becomes kind of an example to us. We have this word that we use when we look at things in the Old Testament. We call them types. In a sense, Enoch was like a type of the church. What do I mean by that? Well, it's like he represents, what happened to him is similar to what is going to happen to the church. There's only one other person in the Bible that is said to have been taken up into heaven without going through the process of death. Maybe some of you might know who that is. Well, it's Elijah. And you know that story about the chariot of fire coming down from heaven. He hops on the chariot and just flies up into heaven. So he and Enoch are in a very exclusive club. They're the only people that thus far have, gone to heaven that way. But when we look at Enoch, it's really a picture of something that will be happening in the future for all of us who are followers of God. And this all happens in the last day. Now, we don't know when it's going to happen, but it's an event called the rapture. And the Bible is, full of prophecies about things that haven't happened yet. And this is one of those really big things that the Bible says is going to happen. It's called the rapture, and it's a time when Christ will come and he will, it says that we as his followers will be caught up in the sky with him. And I think what we see in the life of Enoch is kind of maybe you could think of it as a preview of the rapture, but it's something that we all can be encouraged by, because it's something we as believers and followers of Christ can look forward to. Well, we come to the next guy. This happens to be Enoch's son, and we read about him in Genesis 5:25 to 27. When Methuselah had lived 187 years, he became the father of Lamech. Now, this is a different Lamech than we were talking about last time, that descendant of Cain. This is a totally different person, same name though. Verse 26, after he became the father of Lamech, Methuselah lived 782 years and had other sons and daughters. And altogether, Methuselah lived a total of 969 years, and he died. And in doing so, he set the record of being the oldest person ever to live. We talk about people that make it to 100 these days, and we think that's a big deal. But no, 969 years, the oldest man who ever lived. But there's something very interesting about Methuselah. And this is the thing, something that we learn when we look at these numbers, at all these genealogies, and we start looking at the years and how many years so-and-so lived. But we read, we know that Methuselah died when he was 969 years old, because the Bible tells us that. Now, we also know that Methuselah has his son Lamech when he's 187. Lamech has his son Noah when he's 182. Follow me here, don't get lost. And that Noah lives for 600 years before he steps on the ark and before, the flood comes. Now, if you were to add 600 plus 182 plus 187, guess what they add up to? They add up to 969. In case I lost you there, what it means is that Methuselah died the same year as the flood came. So just before the flood came, Methuselah died, so he doesn't have to tread water for a few hours before he drowns, in part of God's mercy. But the other really interesting thing, when you know what the name Methuselah means, it takes on a whole new significance, because the name Methuselah means, one way to interpret it is, when he dies, judgment will come. when he dies, judgment will come. And so that's exactly what happened. The year that he died is the year that God sent the judgment of the flood on the earth. Because we know that Noah was 600 years. Noah was 500 years old when he started building the ark. It took him 100 years, so that by the time he steps on the ark, he's 600 years old. I guess, what do we learn about that? We learn about God's sovereignty, that God is in control, God is in charge of things, and that he knew that Methuselah was going to represent, I guess, almost like a human clock in terms of, marking off the time before this judgment would come. So this is one of these interesting Bible facts that can be a real encouragement. Well, we'll finish up now. We're going to look at the last few people in this line in Genesis 5, 28 to 31. When Lamech lived 182 years, he had a son, and he named him Noah. And he said, "He will comfort us in the labor and painful toil of our hands, caused by the ground the Lord had cursed." And after Noah was born, Lamech lived 595 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Lamech lived a total of 777 years, and then he died. Well, these are the last two people in this line of Seth. Of course, Noah goes on to have three sons that are very, kind of the same pattern that we had with Cain as his three sons. Those last three sons of his were mentioned in his genealogy, and the last three sons in Seth's genealogy are Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Those are the sons that Noah eventually has. But what do we learn? Well, Noah is said to be to have some significance. He is described as being, he will comfort us in labor and painful toil of our hands, caused by the ground that the Lord had cursed. That they were struggling to just keep alive, and the whole ground had been cursed as a result of sin. And now Noah is going to, play this very important role in preserving mankind, as his three sons and their wives, so you've got 8 people altogether, Noah, his wife, and the other three couples. But these are the only people that are going to survive the flood. And as we said before, that's the one significant difference between the line of Cain and the line of Seth. Seth's descendants go on to repopulate the earth after the flood. So all these things are interesting. And the other thing, just one more of those number things, Lamech was the 7th generation from Seth, and he lived to be 777 years old. Remember that number 7, we were talking about how that is, God's perfect number. And it's a number that we see just kind of embedded in creation in all these different ways. So I don't know if there's any significance or any meaning to that, but it's just kind of interesting. He's the 7th generation. He lives 777 years. So how do we wrap this up? What do we learn from these genealogies? I think one of the important things is that we understand that when we read this, a lot of people look at Genesis and they say, this is just a bunch of fairy tales, it's all fiction, none of it's real, it's like a big analogy and a myth. And we don't believe that as part of our biblical worldview, as we accept this as history. And the interesting thing about it, and the part that the genealogies play in all of this, is that if this was fiction, why would you bother writing all these names? You can read a book of fiction and you'll learn a few names and you might know a father or son or whatever here or there, but it's not as important because you're just writing a pretend story. But if you read a book of history, if you like to read history, you're going to find that there's all kinds of dates and names and numbers, because you are actually talking about things that really happened. And that's the reason, these genealogies remind us that these were real people. Why would they even be named if they were just pretend people? So that's one of the reasons why genealogies are important. And the other is because it just reminds us once again about the sovereignty of God. Just like we were talking about with Methuselah and the meaning of his name and the fact that the earth indeed was judged the year that he died. But there's all kinds of other predictions like that in the Bible. And we're going to just end. This is going to be our good verse to end with today. A verse from the book of Daniel. Daniel is another Old Testament person. He comes along, I don't know, a few thousand years after Noah, or a few hundred. Well, I don't know. We can do the math. But Daniel was a prophet, and he lived later in the history of Israel when they were in captivity in Babylon. And he plays this really important role because the king of Babylon is, they took all of Israel into captivity, and now he's, lording it over all of the Jews. But Daniel was able to establish himself as a man of God. And when Nebuchadnezzar has this dream and he sees essentially the whole history of the world from his point on in these images, but he doesn't know what they are. So Daniel comes and he explains it all to him, and he talks about how the whole realm of history will end. And it just reminds us again of the sovereignty of God. So this verse is in Daniel 2:44, and the context is he's explaining to the king all the things that he saw about the future, and he kind of wraps it all up by saying this is where everything is going to end. In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. We saw that word crush. That's the same word that was used back in Genesis 3 about he will crush the head of Satan. And most kingdoms, that's the interesting thing about studying history, kingdoms will rise and they'll get real powerful, and then they all fall apart and some other king will come along and beat them up. And this is really the cycle of history, human history. But what the Bible is telling us and what Daniel is pointing towards is this time when God will come and he will establish his kingdom. And this is the encouraging thing when we think about something even like a genealogy, because it reminds us that God is mindful of every single one of us. And not everybody gets their names written in the genealogies of the Bible, but God knows every one of our names, whether your name is recorded in the Bible or not. It doesn't matter. God knows each one of us, and God, as we said before, has a wonderful plan for each one of us. And we have so much to look forward to when we follow him and we continue on understanding, this biblical worldview. And this is a really big part of it, the fact that God is in charge, that he's sovereign. So I hope this has been, an encouragement to you. I know some of these things, if you just sort of read them and you scratch your head, who are all these people and what are these names about? Well, I hope this kind of unravels some of the mystery a little bit, and I hope that you'll join us next time as we continue on in chapter 5, and where some really weird things are going to happen. But I just want you to remember that I'm thinking of you guys and praying for you, and hope you will join us again next time.